Amen.
Amen. So I wanted to quickly introduce our first speaker for the morning, Jennifer Jill Schwirzer. I know her as Jen the Fire Engine. That's her nickname. Just because she is a fire engine, she's inspiring. She'll kick your butt. Don't mess with her, okay? But she's very nice. She's wonderful. And I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Jennifer lives in Orlando, Florida with her husband, Michael. They have 2 adult daughters and a great little dog named Fred. Jennifer runs a private counseling practice, writes books, makes music, hosts a TV program, presents seminars, and loves Jesus and people. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Jill.
Just going to get a little drink of water from my flask. We've been joking all week with my team about how terrible it would be if we drank, because the things we'd say about this particular topic would be, really bad. But then they give us this flask that looks like it might have vodka in it. It's really water, I promise. You can try some later. But good morning, and I'm so glad to be here. I'm really thrilled with the opportunity. I want to start out with a story. I want to start out with the story of JJ. JJ was 10 years old when her parents came into the living room one evening and said that the family was going to be moving to another state. All JJ had ever known was the cute little quaint town where she'd grown up. All her friends were there, all her memories were there. She put her face in her hands and cried. But ultimately, JJ dried her tears, and the first day at her new school, she put on what she thought was a really pretty dress, only to discover that the clothing she was wearing was completely out of fashion in this new environment in which she found herself. Not only was she marginalized, but ultimately there was a group of girls in the school that were kind of the mean girls of the school, and they decided to target her, and a bullying endeavor began, to where JJ would get off the bus in the morning, walk across the threshold of the school, and from the moment she did that, they would dog her steps with insults all day long. Unfortunately, it didn't die out from there. JJ experienced assault on the playground. They were bullies. They drug her out to the baseball diamond, away from the supervising eyes of the teachers and playground supervisors, threw her down in the dirt, and a group of girls physically and sexually assaulted her and just really marked her for life. After the ordeal, JJ sat, grass matted in her hair, her face wet with crying, her clothing disheveled, and the teacher saw her. But the teacher didn't do anything, and the reason the teacher didn't do anything is because the teacher understood that if she punished the perpetrators would punish JJ. And so she kind of pretty much left it alone. But really what was going on there was the teachers and staff of that school, even though they knew bullying was going on, they lacked the passion, the drive, and the know-how to be able to change the culture in that school to where there was zero tolerance for bullying. But that's not who's sitting here this morning. We're here because we want to be equipped, we want to be inspired, and we want to be in a community of people that are willing to be culture changers and world changers. And that's what this weekend is for. It is for the purpose of equipping all of us to be better at dealing with abuse in the world. What I've done here is I've condensed down the mission statement that you can see on the website. What we're doing here this weekend is we're educating. We're also listening. We're trying to create a safe place for people that have experienced abuse. There's a lot of overlap between becoming equipped ourselves and needing ministry to ourselves, because the greatest offenders are the ones that have been through and have their own story. So we're listening to one another. We're also learning to prevent abuse. We're learning and we're facing the reality that there will be abuse, and sometimes what we'll need to do is confront existing abuse. We won't always be successful in preventing it. And we're going to learn how to be advocates and defenders of the vulnerable. And I really like the fact that this particular event is taking a very broad-based approach. We're not talking about one specific kind of abuse. We're talking about abuse as a universal phenomena. And so individual people will be drilling down into the details of particulars, but we're going to be addressing abuse as a broad topic. And that's kind of what I'm doing up here this morning, is I'm going to kind of frame out the issue. I'm just going to talk about abuse. I don't specialize in any one given area, except that I personally am a survivor of sexual abuse, but I am just going to try to create a context in which the other experts, and we have some really awesome people here. I'm really excited about the presentations that are coming. The other experts will be able to unpack particular issues that will fit your particular situations. So let me give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to just give a general definition of abuse. I'm going to talk a bit about prevalence. It's kind of difficult to find stats on how prevalent is abuse, so I'm going to take individual types of abuse and show some statistics about prevalence. I can't do a comprehensive job, but I'll give you some idea of what's going on. Then we're going to talk about the effect, what happens to people when they experience abuse, of course in broad terms. And then I'm going to talk about some solutions. So let's go to a definition. First of all, what is abuse? Well, dictionary definition, cruel or inhumane treatment. Cruel implies apathy or even pleasure on the part of the one exercising cruelty. Inhumane means to lack the basic decency and empathies that should characterize humanity. So really what abuse is just being cruel. And the strange reality is that some people get twisted in their characters such that they get a certain amount of pleasure out of being cruel and controlling other people. We talk about the dark triad of traits in narcissism, being psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. So just to give you quick definitions of those, psychopathy is lacking conscience and empathy. Narcissism is extreme vanity and entitlement. Machiavellianism is self-interest at any cost. We talk about politicians being Machiavellian because they'll do anything to win the election, even lie about what party they're really part of, stuff like that. And sadism, which is deriving pleasure from causing pain. So we're calling it the dark tetrad of traits now because we've added sadism. Some people actually get something out of hurting other people. And that's the grim reality of being a human being. Those of us that are here, most of us anyway, I hope, are not people that get any kind of pleasure out of the pain of others, or any kind of sick, twisted pleasure out of controlling or micromanaging others, or any other form of abuse. We don't really like that, but people can actually develop an appetite for that type of thing. There are a number of different kinds of abuse: physical, sexual, those are relatively tangible types of abuse, but then there's emotional, verbal, and psychological. Emotional is more harming people emotionally. Psychological is more playing with their mind, so to speak. Financial abuse is a terrible reality to elderly people or to spouses, children. There's such a thing as religious abuse. I'll be sharing some stories of religious abuse where in a religious context, spiritual things are used to control and harm other people. And then there's just generic neglect where you're put in position in someone's life to care for them and you do not. What about the prevalence of abuse? Let's look at some prevalence statistics here. Let's talk about bullying for a moment. Between 10 and 65% of children experience bullying at some point in their lives. Cyberbullying, which is a relatively new phenomena, ranges from 5 to 21%, and girls are more vulnerable to cyberbullying. The reasons for bullying, and I put reasons in quotes because there's no good reason for bullying anyone ever, but I put reason in quotes. There are motivations for bullying, and they fall pretty neatly into 4 quadrants. Number 1, physical appearance, people that look a little bit different. Number 2, gender and sexual orientation. It's a big motivator for bullying. Number 3, ethnicity or national origin. And then number 4 is like kind of the wastebasket. Everything else goes in there. Let's talk for just a moment about child abuse. This is something nobody likes to think about, but it's a grim reality in the world in which we live. 1 billion children, 12 to 17, have experienced abuse in the past year. Almost 8% of males and 20% of females are sexually abused by 18. Now, I know someone is sitting here going, no, it's more than that. And the reality is that there are vast differences in the studies and the research that's done, such that we don't really know what the actual numbers are. But we do know that most abuse is by relatives, and we also know that child abuse statistics are notoriously deflated due to underreporting. Think about it. That child has grown up in an environment where abuse is their normal. And they go to, typically what happens with child abuse is the abuse itself perpetrated by individuals that are put in place by God to protect that child, and instead they're violating that child. That abuse signals a profound failure on the part of the family system. So what's going to happen to that child is that they're going to try to maybe tell someone in the family that they were abused, but they're going to get shut down, and it's going to be minimized, and they're going to experience secondary trauma. So as a result of this and other phenomena, child abuse statistics are extremely underreported. We really don't have a sense of the numbers. RAIN, which is a wonderful website with lots of information, says that every 11 seconds, Child Protective Services substantiates a claim of child sexual abuse. So that's happened about maybe, 20 times since I started talking, if you can imagine such a thing, substantiating claims. What about abuse of women? 1 in 3 women globally have been raped, and by the way, all these, I tried to go for global statistics here, so unless otherwise noted, these are global numbers. So 1 in 3 women have been raped, beaten, or coerced into sex. Almost 1 in 3 women report some form of relationship violence. More than 1 in 3 murders of women are committed by partners. And we could go on and on with that one. I'm just touching on each of these individual areas. We don't often think of abuse of men, so I want to talk about that briefly. Men are overrepresented as perpetrators and victims of violence. And really, if you think about it, in the broadest terms, any kind of violence against another human being or animal is what? It's abuse. And so men, because they are overrepresented as victims of violence, are abused. Violence against women is about 1/3 more likely to be reported. The reason for this is because of stereotypes. Not only does the man feel like he can't say anything about it because he's a man and he's supposed to be able to take care of himself, but he goes to the police station and they're so used to seeing another configuration where it's the man doing the abusing and the woman being abused that they don't know what to do with this strange configuration of the man being abused. And so because they're out of their comfort zone, they don't handle it as efficiently. So men are overrepresented as victims of homicide, war crimes, mass killings. Men experience abuse too. Intimate partner violence. Globally, 5 to 10% of men experience intimate partner violence. There's a story of John Wesley. He was a small man, and his wife was physically abusive to him. She would drag him across the floor by his hair. He had a brother, Charles, who was the great poet. He wrote many hymns. And John Wesley was a great preacher, and a Reformation preacher. And Charles made the comment once that Charles had the kind of marriage that was conducive to him staying home and writing poetry, but John had the kind of marriage that compelled him to go out and preach the gospel. So he was gone a lot because he was being abused at home. Globally, where did I stop here? Globally, up to 61% of women experience intimate partner violence, and globally, up to 59% of women experience intimate partner sexual violence. What about sexual abuse by clergy? This is one that really makes our blood run cold because that individual is supposed to be representing God, and we're going to have some other presenters talking about how it affects that person's concept of God when they're abused by clergy. Catholic authorities themselves say that in the last 50 years, 1.5 to 5% of clergy are involved in abuse. That's Catholic authorities themselves admitting this. So if we do the math, with approximately 425,000 clergy, that's 21,250 clergy are admittedly, by the denomination they're part of, abusing. 80 to 90% of these cases are ephebophilia versus pedophilia. We typically think of clergy abusing children, prepubescent children, but the majority of the cases are postpubescent adolescent children. Protestant statistics, don't pound your chest if you're a Protestant, because Protestant statistics are similar. It's just that it's a little more difficult to track because a lot of Protestantism is non-denominational churches, so they're not as networked with one another. A little more difficult to figure things out, but we've just recently heard about 380 leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention facing allegations. So it's just as common because it's about human beings and not about one particular religion. What about this very difficult, intangible thing that we call emotional/psychological or verbal abuse? It can be difficult to quantify these things, but the courts are starting to recognize that these are factors in the way people function. So for instance, in the UK, the stand-up comedian Justin Lee Collins was given 140 hours of community service because he was verbally abusing his girlfriend, and she recorded it and presented it to the courts, and they gave him that sentence. It's not very severe, but at least they did something. And then there was a woman named Sally Challen who killed her emotionally abusive husband, and she was allowed to appeal her 22-year conviction. Again, that's in the UK. So the courts are starting to see that emotional abuse is a force to be reckoned with. And if you think about it, we're such emotional beings. When we neglect the emotional aspect of our being, we're just really pretty much being very ignorant. One study of 1,000 women showed that 39% had been emotionally abused in the past year. Now, this is going to be hard for some people to hear, but the statistics of females perpetrating emotional abuse on males may be even higher, because some research shows that although men are more physically aggressive, women tend to be more emotionally aggressive. So, and I'm just saying, I have a counseling practice, and I've had a few couples where there's been emotional abuse by the woman on the man, and it can make a man come to his knees. It's very, very, very painful, and it can destroy a marriage, to be frank. There are two common tactics used in emotional abuse. There are many more, and we'll have presenters that'll be unpacking this more completely than I could, but one of them is surveillance or spying. And personally, I hear people say, well, my wife can look in my phone anytime she wants. And if you're willing for your partner to have access to your stuff, that's fine. But I don't think it should be the decision of the partner. I think it should be the decision of the person to give that access to the partner. I think people are allowed to have a private life when they're married. So this surveillance thing is often argued, well, we're married, we should have no secrets from each other. But I don't think that means that we have no private information. That's my personal opinion. Surveillance is one of the tactics. Gaslighting is another, where you lead a person to question their own memory, their own intelligence, and so forth, and you kind of destabilize their sense of being a thinking person. I want to summarize this with a statement from the 19th century writer Ellen White. She said, "Our world is a vast laser house," and a laser house is a place where people with infectious diseases came basically to die. So our world is a vast laser house, a scene of misery that we dare not allow even our thoughts to dwell upon. Did we realize it as it is, the burden would be too terrible, yet God feels it all. God feels your pain. If you're a victim, a survivor of abuse, God feels every ounce of pain that you've experienced and the pain of all those that you care about. Let's talk about the effect of abuse. I think the best way to give a quick nutshell idea capsule of how abuse affects people is to look at the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Has anybody here heard of these? Okay. Very, very well-published studies, and I'm going to just start by telling you a story that led up to the studies. This is really fascinating to me. This is the Dr. Vincent Felitti, with whom it pretty much all started. In the 1980s, Dr. Felitti was working with Kaiser Permanente Hospital System in their weight loss clinic, and he noticed that 55% of the participants in the weight loss clinic dropped out, even though most of them were losing weight. So they dropped out of the clinics, and he wanted to know why. So he began a process of interviewing the dropouts, and a very interesting event became an aha moment for him. He was talking to a woman and asking a series of questions. Now, doctors often ask, at what age was your first sexual experience? But because he was asking a weight loss questions, or questions about a weight loss clinic, he said mistakenly, and didn't realize it when it came out of his mouth, "How much did you weigh when you had your first sexual experience?" And he hears the woman answer him. I think he's looking down. He hears the woman answer 40 pounds, and he looks up and he realizes what happened. And then she looked down at the floor and said, "It was my father." And he had this aha moment where he realized that she's a victim of abuse. Maybe that has something to do with why she dropped out. Because they say to be overweight is to be overlooked. And I've heard from more than one person that they purposely gained weight to get people to go away when they were being sexually abused. He continued his interview process. He met one woman who was raped at 23 and gained over 100 pounds in the following year. Then he teamed up with the Center for Disease Control, and they ended up interviewing over 17,000 people. And they developed out of that the adverse childhood experiences studies. And basically what they say is these adverse childhood experiences, and it's a fairly broad-based thing, not just sexual abuse, but all forms of abuse or trauma, set people up for social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which then tends to predict adoption of health risk behaviors, which then tends to predict disease, disability, and social problems, which then predicts early death. This is a very despairing and sad picture. Fortunately, the enemy only writes part of our story, and God and we can partner to write the rest of it. He maybe can write a chapter in the book, but this is not the end of the story. And one of the things we're going to be presenting on Sunday, by the way, is recovery from trauma, and we're going to go into some detail about that. Let's talk about solutions. What can we do in response to the abuse crisis? I'm going to give you 5 principles, and I'm going to use stories to illustrate the principles. Number 1, we can speak up. We can tell our stories, and did you know that just telling your story can be tremendously therapeutic? You're as sick as your secrets, they say. What you bury, you marry. When people open up and talk, just finding that one person to hear them out, what it does basically to tell your story is it enables you to leave it, at least for a period of time. The human mind has this tremendous drive to archive history, and if we feel like we're the only one that knows what happened to us, we're going to hang on to it, often to the point where it keeps revisiting us in the form of post-traumatic stress. So what we find is that when people can just share their story with someone, it's kind of an offloading process, and they know where to find it if they need it, but for now they can let go of it. So we need to learn how to speak up. We also need to learn how to listen to one another, because if there's going to be speakers, there need to be listeners. We need to learn how to trust in a new way, because our trust has been broken. We also need to learn how to defend others. There's a continuum from recovery yourself to helping others recover, and the most recovered people I know are the ones that are in the trenches helping others. And then we've got to keep believing. We got to keep believing that we can heal. We got to keep believing that the systems that we're part of can heal. The families, the communities, the schools, the churches can experience change. So let me take each one of those and use a story to illustrate it. This is Marguerite. Little Marguerite Annie Johnson's parents divorced. A few years later, when she was just 8 years old, her mother's boyfriend raped her. Now, Marguerite did tell her brother, and her brother told the police, and the man spent a day in jail, a whole day. They let him go after a day in jail, but then Marguerite had some uncles that were pretty miffed about that, and they beat the man to death. This is what happened to Marguerite. She said to herself, I thought my voice killed him. I killed that man because I told his name. And then I thought I would never speak again because my voice would kill anyone. She stopped speaking for 5 years at 8 years old. But during that time of self-imposed silence, she read and developed this taste for literature. And ultimately, Maya Angelou became a great writer herself, a writer of 7 autobiographies. So Maya teaches us how to speak. This is the story of Charlie. I literally pulled this off the web. There are many of them out there. Charlie's stepfather moved in when she was 2. He was a violent alcoholic. She watched him beat her mother up over and over again. They would cringe when they heard the key in the lock when he'd come home at the end of the day after being at the pub all day, because they knew what was going to happen. But it got worse. He sexually abused Charlie when she was 4 years old. And the sexual abuse continued. He violated her, then he made her and her brother do things in front of him. He was an awful, evil man. Ultimately got her pregnant. She's 14 years old. He pays for the abortion. She gets an abortion. Finally, when she's 17 years old, she's able to get a job and an apartment and leave that place. But she is one hurting unit, and she's never told anyone because she talked to her mom, and her mom would say, I don't know where I'd go. So she's really hurting inside, and she's at this job, and she makes a friend named Allison. And Allison one day asks her, how are you? And you know how we ask each other, how you doing? You know, and we don't really mean it. Well, Allison meant it. You seem a little off. There's something about your presentation. You just don't seem like you're doing very well. And that opened the floodgates. And Charlie told her this whole story. First time she ever told anyone outside of her family what was going on all those years since she was a tiny child. And Allison said, there's this thing called Childline. This is in the UK. She said, I'll help you call them. And Charlie called Childline. And she met Veronica, and she went into even more detail with Veronica about all that had happened all those years. And Veronica walked with her and mentored her step by step. And Charlie was able to call the police and report him, and he did time in jail. So Charlie teaches us to listen when we ask people, how are you? Really mean it, at least some of the time, when you do have time. Gabriel teaches us about trust. Now, Gabriel's someone I love dearly and know personally. He's not ready to come out in the open about his story. But I'm going to obscure the details of it enough to where you will never be able to figure out who he is. But I want to tell you what happened to Gabriel. He attended a Christian school. In the school was a very lovely, apparently, teacher. She befriended the family. It was a small community, and everybody knew everybody else, and so there were a lot of overlap with friendship and teachers and pastors and all this stuff. She started coming over to the home, and the mother was just thrilled. This woman took such an interest in her children, and she was washing dishes and just really being part of the family, not realizing she was being groomed. That's so sad, isn't it, that when people are just attentive and loving and care about people, we have to worry about that? But this is the world in which we live. And I'm not saying we should become paranoid, but we do need to be wise as serpents, although harmless as doves. And they were not wise as serpents. They didn't understand this thing. And so what ended up happening was the teacher molested Gabriel. It wasn't a severe enough molestation for it to be a crime, and I'm not going to go into detail about that, but each state is different, and the police couldn't do anything beyond filing a police report. But it was still wrong, and it was still abuse. And we have to realize, those of us that work in church circles, that it's not only the prosecutable offenses or criminal offenses that we want to deal with. We want to have a higher standard than the world, not a lower one. And so, unfortunately, the school system of which Gabriel was a part did not deal with the teacher. And there were other reports on this teacher, left her, didn't want to hurt her feelings. She was doing so well being a teacher. We don't want to hurt that person. So worried about hurting that person that they decimated Gabriel. And he ended up inpatient for a period of time. It wasn't his fault. He's not a crazy person. It's what happened to him that put him there. So Gabriel's trust in the system was broken. His brothers and sisters' trust in the church system was broken. This is a sad thing we have to deal with, and this is why we say that doing this abuse work is really evangelism to those that have become disenchanted with church circles because nobody spoke up, nobody did anything. So he and his brothers and sisters became disillusioned with the church, but fortunately, they had a strong family. And there were bonds of love and trust in that family, and those bonds held. You know, if you can't trust one person, don't assume you'll never be able to trust anyone. Here's the tricky part of trust, is it's true. We get hurt and we think, well, I can't trust. But the reality is that a lifestyle of complete distrust of everyone is harmful in and of itself, because we are created in the image of a relational God. We are created to love and be loved, and the only way to form love relationships is through trust. There has to be a foundation of trust there. So what we do is we try to trust more intelligently, try to trust in a better way, moving through an abuse situation. And that's something that we hope to be helping you with on Sunday as well. I want to let Sam speak about defending the weak and being advocates. Sam and Steve were a couple. They had just joined the church. Sam was dealing with some trauma from her past, and she decided to counsel with her pastor. She wanted good, religiously based Christian counseling. Well, he seemed like a nice enough guy until he raped her in the very office where this help was supposed to be taking place. If you can imagine the fallout of that, there was a long period of recovery, but ultimately both Sam and Steve said, we want to do something. We want to channel the energy of this outrage into helping other people. And they set up an organization called the Hope of Survivors. And here's their URL. They have a wonderful website with lots and lots of information and 10 to 15,000 unique visits a month to that website. They're a registered nonprofit in the US, Australia, Romania, with divisions in Canada, the UK, the Philippines, Trinidad, Tobago, and South Africa. They've done all this stuff out of that pain. And so they teach us how to defend the weak and vulnerable. The last story I'm going to tell you is the story of Jennifer, myself. You may have figured out that the JJ I was talking about in the beginning of the presentation was me. I was a victim of bullying, sexual and physical assault on a playground when I was about 12 years old, and it was a group of girls that bullied me. And I wish I could say that the abuse ended there, but years later as a young adult, I joined a religious ministry, and I was really excited about being part of this ministry. It was a group of young people, but it had a very fundamentalist flavor, and you can kind of see that in this picture. And we're all wearing like long dresses and singing hymns and scripture songs in a park somewhere. And this picture is going to even be more pointed in that I was not even allowed to ride a horse in pants. So you see me wearing a dress. I'm sorry how blurry the pictures are, but these are ancient. I'm dating myself, but this was a long time ago. But there I am riding a horse, and a Clydesdale no less, in a dress, because that was what we were told was modest and appropriate. So it was very much a purity culture. But what I find in purity culture, and I'm not disparaging people that really do value modesty, and I want to leave you with God on that one. People have left me with God, and it's been awesome. And here I am wearing jeans in a public presentation, tight jeans no less. But anyway, I tell the Lord all the time, if you want me to go back to wearing long dresses, you tell me to do that. And then he sends me to Michigan in the winter, and I'm like, I'm not going to wear dresses, So anyway, that was the environment. And in purity culture, what I find is that women are blamed for the sins of men, basically. And so here I was, a young adult, brand new to this religion and to ministry, and I was so excited and really open, and I thought the leaders walked on air, but the leader of the ministry was a multiple count abuser and abused just about every woman in that ministry. So I'll tell you a couple stories. The first assault happened. He was not a rapist, so I was able to fight him off. Plus, I'm a black belt. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, he was not a rapist, didn't force himself physically on me, because he really valued the chase, and he wanted to know that you liked him. That meant a lot to him. So when I made it clear that I did not want to get physical with him, he did back off. But then he tried again later, and this time it was in a car, and I was dropping him off at an airport, and I was in the passenger seat, he was in the driver's seat, and he lunged at me, and I went into the fetal position. He came down on top of me, but he eventually got the hint that I wasn't interested, and I jumped into the driver's seat and drove away. So I went through a long crucible because he had given me a very long letter after the first assault telling me it was all my fault. And I knew that if I came forward about it, that I would be blamed by everyone in this ministry. I knew it. But I got to the place where I was going to speak up anyway, because it was starting to drag me under the undertow. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to speak up here. So I told select people, not everyone. And what happened as a result of me sharing is all of the other experiences that were going on in this very small group, maybe of 30 people, living on a farm in New Jersey and ministering in Manhattan at a restaurant that we owned. It's like in this very small community, the testimonies of other women came belching forward, and all this disclosure came out, and we realized how broad this problem was. Unfortunately, the organization that governed over that ministry did nothing and left him there, and so what happened is we one by one left and then recovered. And for years after, and I still to some degree get letters from people, tell me about this guy and what you went through, and I would tell them the truth. Ultimately, I wrote a spiritual autobiography. It's called The Testimony of a Seeker. You can get it in ebook form. It's out of print now, but you can find it online if you want to read it. And I talked about my experience with this guy, but I used a pseudonym because I wasn't going to be like, hey, sue me, so I used a pseudonym to describe him and what I'd been through. Years later, a certain woman came under his spell, and what he would do is try to pry the wife and the husband apart. And he convinced her that her husband was bad for her and she should leave him. So she left him, went to another state, went into a bookstore, found my book for some reason, bought the book, read it, and recognized the guy from my description. Guy didn't even use his name. And she went back to her husband. So does speaking up matter? Does it make a difference? It most certainly does, and I'm very, very grateful for how God was able to use that. So I want to ask you a quick question in closing here. Would you rather have $10,000 per day for 30 days or a penny that doubled in value every day for 30 days? Just tell me right off the top of your head. $10,000 a day, raise your hand. A penny that doubled in value. You guys already know this. Okay. Oh, well, anyway, when I answered this, I guess I'm kind of dumb here because I answered this. I was like, I'd take the $10,000 a day because a penny's never going to get there. A penny is over 5 million after 30 days if it doubles in value every day. That's the power of multiplication. We're not working on the power of addition here. We're working on the power of multiplication because not only are we going to try to minister to victims, but we're going to try to equip victims, equip survivors to go on and double the value out there and minister to other survivors who will then become defenders, and we're going to keep that going until we multiply into 5 million strong. There's a story of a little boy on the beach. You remember this story? He comes along the beach, and the starfish are washing up on the shore, and the sun is rising. The little boy knows that the starfish are going to die in that sun, and so he starts throwing them back one by one. Old man comes along, he sees what the little boy is doing, and he says, you're never going to make a difference because there's so many starfish, just one little boy. Little boy throws back a starfish and says, I made a difference for that one. I love that story because it celebrates the power of the small, amen? But I want to take it to a new level because what if that little boy mentored or discipled that old man in starfish throwing, and he became a starfish thrower? And then what if another guy came along and the old man mentored someone and discipled someone in starfish throwing? They could have their 5 million starfish throwers there on that beach and clean the beach off. And that's what we're hoping for here. That's what I'm praying for with this organization. With this event. I'm really excited about this because it's not just an event, and Dominique has said this over and over. It's the beginning of a movement. And there are different components. There's the Bucket Brigade, and there's the Project Safe Church, and there's other ministries, and we're all coming together. We're not competing with one another. We're cooperating with one another because the job is far too big for anyone to have to be the vast clearinghouse of all abuse ministry. If the Lord leads you to start a ministry, start one. We'll support you. We'll pray for you. And God will get all the tops spinning in the right direction and in concert with one another. So we're working on the principle of multiplication. I remember lying in the dirt that day, and I believe the enemy said to me, you will never rise up out of this dirt. It'll cling to you for the rest of your life. Well, I want to tell you, I did rise up. And I'm here a happy, healed person because I did rise up. But I didn't just rise up and tell my story. I listened to other people, and I was able to be used by God to help them in their healing process. And I was able to help people regain trust and learn how to trust more effectively. And I was able to teach people how to be defenders. And God used me and my nonprofit corporation to start the Bucket Brigade and now Project Safe Church, where we're actually training people in becoming defenders. And I did rise up out of that dust, and I became really like you are becoming a fulfillment of Isaiah 60, where it says, rise up and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. Behold, the darkness will cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. There's nothing as dark as the topic of abuse. So there's going to be darkness this weekend, but there's also going to be light, because the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. Lift up your eyes round about, and see all they who gather together. Your sons will come from far, and your daughters from the ends of the earth. Welcome to the Rise Up Rally. We're going to rise up, amen?
I need to give you a hug. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Wasn't that wonderful? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And thank you for what you do, Jennifer.